Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'll start with the usual update on the COVID-19 statistics. An additional 14 positive cases were confirmed yesterday, which takes the total now in Scotland to 18,170. A total of 867 patients are currently in hospital with the virus either confirmed or suspected. That is 66 more than yesterday, but the increase is all in suspected cases. The number of confirmed cases has reduced by 3. A total of 15 people last night were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, and that is 1 fewer than yesterday. Since 5th March, a total of 3,978 patients who had tested positive and needed hospital treatment have now been discharged from hospital. And in the last 24 hours, I'm pleased to say that no deaths were registered of a patient confirmed through a test as having COVID-19. That figure is, of course, extremely welcome, but we must bear in mind that fewer deaths tend to be registered on Sundays. So the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement of people confirmed by a test as having the virus is therefore still 2,472. And I want to send my deepest condolences to everyone behind these statistics who has lost a loved one as a result of this illness. And let me also again today express my thanks to health and care workers and indeed to all key workers across the country. Everybody is exceedingly grateful to you for everything you have done and continue to do. Our progress in suppressing this virus continues to be good as these statistics bear out, though of course we mustn't be complacent. But our progress does allow us to consider now whether and to what extent we can give more clarity in terms of indicative dates for the next steps in our route map out of lockdown. So as a heads up today, I intend to set out more detail on that later this week. However, as we do so, we must remember, all of us, that the virus hasn't gone away. There are already countries, China and Germany, for example, that are right now dealing with spikes in cases as a result of significant outbreaks. And health officials in South Korea have said today that they think the country is now experiencing a second wave. So I know that when numbers of cases and deaths here are continuing to fall, it's very tempting for all of us to think that it's all over and we should just now quickly get back to normal. We are trying to get back to normal and we want to do that as quickly as possible. But let me reiterate my strong view that acting recklessly now would be a serious mistake. We must continue to be cautious and all of us must continue to adhere strictly to the public health advice. That will help us continue progress and avoid a resurgence of the virus now, but it will also hopefully put us in a much stronger position ahead of the winter months to come. So please stick to the rules, and when you are out and about, as all of us are able to be more now, remember facts. Face coverings in enclosed spaces. These are mandatory today on public transport, from today on public transport. Avoid crowded places, even outdoors. Clean your hands regularly as well as surfaces. Maintain 2 metres distance from people in other households, and self-isolate and book a test immediately if you have symptoms of COVID. Now, today's news conference is slightly different and following a slightly different format from usual. There's one significant item that I want to update you on today, and it relates to the economy. Once I've finished my remarks, I'm going to hand over to Benny Higgins, who joins me today. Benny is the chair of our advisory group on economic recovery. The Scottish Government appointed the advisory group back in April to provide recommendations on how best to restore the economy to sustainable and inclusive growth as we bring the COVID pandemic under greater control. And we did that because we knew then that the pandemic and what we had to do to tackle it would cause significant economic harm. Our initial focus has had to be on protecting people's lives, obviously, and on providing immediate lifeline support to keep businesses afloat and people employed. But as the pandemic does come under more control, our efforts must increasingly focus on how the economy recovers and renews itself for the long term. So I'm very grateful to Benny and the advisory group members for all of their efforts. I'm also grateful to all of the businesses, business organisations and others who engage so fully in the group's work, and to Lord Robert Smith, who facilitated much of that business engagement. The advisory group's report, which I have received today, includes 25 substantial recommendations. These are wide-ranging in scope. Alongside areas such as investment, employment and skills, they cover areas such as the relationship between government and business, the future of the care sector, the importance of culture and the role of the third sector. The Scottish Government will produce a detailed response to the report before the end of July, so I will not comment in detail today on all 25 recommendations, although Benny will expand on some of its key points. But what I do want to do this morning is be very clear that the Scottish Government sees this report as a serious and substantive piece of work, and that we agree with its basic principles. Many of its themes, for example, the importance of education, employment and tackling inequalities, are clearly going to be critical to our economic recovery. The report is also very strong in highlighting the regional dimension to growth, and its specific recommendations are significant and constructive. For example, the importance of digital infrastructure investment has been emphasised once again by this crisis and is rightly a major issue in the report. In addition, the Scottish Government agrees with the advisory group about the importance of working with the UK Government so that our fiscal framework has enough flexibility within it to enable us to support investment for recovery. We also support the advisory group's prioritisation of a green recovery and its recognition of the vital importance of the new Scottish National Investment Bank. And the report's recommendations for youth employment and a jobs guarantee, including the essential contribution that businesses can make, are potentially very significant as we seek to ensure that young people get the opportunities they deserve in the wake of this pandemic. Finally, the report highlights the fact that Scotland's economic recovery must be a collaborative partnership. The recommendations in this report are not just for the Scottish Government, although many of them of course are, but they are for the business sector, the third sector, our higher and further education sector and the UK Government as well. The Scottish Government already works well with these organisations in many areas, but the COVID crisis has reinforced the crucial importance of those relationships and of ensuring that recovery is a true partnership effort. Above all else, the report is clear-sighted about the scale, the vast scale of the challenge that our economy faces as we come out of this crisis. However, it sets out practical measures founded on values which can help us to address that challenge. It provides recommendations that can help us to help businesses and individuals get back on their feet. And in doing so, I think it potentially lays the foundations for a much more resilient, more sustainable and fairer economy in the years to come. I therefore warmly welcome it and once again want to thank everyone who has contributed to it, and in particular Benny for chairing the group. Now, I'm going to hand over to Benny in a moment or two, but let me just end by reiterating our key public health messages. If we want to get into our recovery phase, it is crucial that we continue efforts to suppress this virus. Since Friday, of course, any household has been able to meet with up to 2 other households, but let me remind you, those meetings right now must be outdoors unless you have formed an extended household group. You should only go indoors to use the toilet or get through to a garden, and you should clean surfaces you touch as you do that. I know, as I indicated at the outset of my remarks, that when you hear me report relatively low numbers of daily cases and thankfully reducing numbers of people dying, many might wonder whether these rules still matter. But it is important to stress that as we start to go out and about more, these rules actually matter more, not less. And it is important to remember that COVID-19 has not gone away. It remains highly infectious and highly dangerous. As I said earlier, we've seen reports in recent days from many other countries of increases in the virus, and that should remind us of the risk that it still poses. And it should remind all of us that it doesn't take much for the virus to take off again. It's only by sticking to the rules that we've made the progress that I report now on a daily basis, and by continuing to stick with them and by suppressing the virus further, we will all be able to move more quickly out of lockdown in the weeks ahead. That's why the decisions all of us are taking now as individuals more than ever directly affect the health, the well-being and indeed the economic prosperity for all of us. The public health campaign we launched on Friday, Facts, which I've mentioned already today, summarises the key points you need to remember and apply. So let me end just by reiterating those 5 crucial key pieces of advice. You must wear face coverings in enclosed spaces, avoid crowded places, clean your hands and hard surfaces regularly, keep 2 metre distancing and self-isolate and book a test if you have symptoms. By remembering and abiding by these 5 basic requirements, all of us can stay safe, we can protect others, and we will all save lives. So please, I ask you to continue to do the right thing and to stick to these rules. Thank you once again to everyone who is doing exactly that. Let me now hand over to Benny Higgins, who will go into a bit more detail about the contents of his report published this morning.
Thank you, First Minister, and good afternoon. The health crisis has tragically claimed too many lives prematurely, and it has been absolutely right that our priority has been to manage the spread of the virus to protect all of us. Today, however, I present a report on another matter, Scotland's economic well-being, as we emerge from the height of the health crisis. The report was commissioned by Scottish Government, but it is a call to action to all of us in Scotland, especially those in positions of leadership in the private sector, the public sector and the third sector. There has never been in our lifetimes a more important time to collaborate across our society to pursue a collective national endeavour. The group I have chaired was asked to look beyond the immediate issues of economic life support for households and businesses, albeit that's been essential, to chart a path that rebuilds Scotland's economy, one that is ultimately stronger and better. Before the onset of COVID-19, we faced a range of economic challenges. Those challenges have not gone away. Some, like the consequences of Brexit, frankly, have become bleaker. Our ambition now must be to build a robust, resilient, well-being economy, an economy that can demonstrate strong economic growth, create jobs, and does so with a focus on the climate emergency and fairness in our society, one that is ready for the inevitable next crisis, not the last one. Our new starting point is one dominated by 3 themes: inequality, education, and unemployment. This crisis has exposed and illuminated the scale of inequalities in our society, and it's even created more. Our recovery must be education-led, one that addresses the learning loss suffered by school children, and one that develops the skills needed in 21st century Scotland, including a focus on vocational training and apprenticeships. And the potential tsunami of unemployment requires urgent intervention. In particular, young people aged between 16 and 25 are at risk of long-term scarring from the imminent recession. They don't deserve it. Today, almost 80% of jobs in Scotland are in the private sector, and over 40% of those jobs are in small businesses with less than 50 employees. Scottish Government must convene the right conversation and engagement with the private sector so that we can think independently, but do so together. We must identify the sectors where Scotland can reasonably aspire to be outstanding and make judicious choices about supporting their survival so they can in future survive and thrive. Renewables, tourism and hospitality, food and drink, universities and colleges, life sciences, digital technology, and the creative sector are among the obvious ones. Let us decide now what a successful Scotland will look like on the other side of this crisis. There are 25 recommendations in this report, as the First Minister has said, and I'd like to give you a flavour now. Internationally, countries are beginning to shift their emphasis from emergency assistance to fiscal stimulus to revive their economies. We must do that too, recognising that the debt will have to be managed carefully over a long period in a manner that aids rather than hinders recovery. The current fiscal arrangements between Scottish Government and UK Government are extremely limiting in what we can do directly for ourselves, despite unprecedented low interest rates. We should pursue urgent discussions to bring greater flexibility, but also persuade the UK Government to act now. On the 4th of June, Germany announced a €130 billion stimulus, which equates to 4% of their economic output. On the same basis, we would deploy stimulus of £6 billion. Lowering VAT to, say, 15% generally, and perhaps to a much lower level for tourism and hospitality, could make a significant difference. Consideration should be given to small business tax incentives to improve adoption of digital technology. It is paramount that the spine of our recovery is green. Scotland should have an entirely realistic ambition to be one of the world's leading countries in tackling climate change, carbon capture and storage, and becoming a circular economy. That is one that decouples economic output and products and services from the dependency on scarce and harmful natural resources. A green Scotland will be high skill, high paying jobs and create a rich market for exports. It is time to quicken the pace by examining where regulatory and planning obstacles can be mitigated without lowering our standards. Another priority area is investment in digital infrastructure. By accelerating existing programmes and developing new ones, we can make changes that benefit flexible working, the rural economy, and economic resilience. In particular, the R100 programme should move faster, and we should follow Ireland by investing in subsea cabling, which has enabled them to become part of the gateway to continental Europe and the United States. Scotland should aim to build a data centre industry that is powered by renewable energy. Apprenticeships will be key. In the absence of intervention, training suffers in a downturn, so policy intervention is essential. There needs to be close engagement between businesses, colleges and universities. We need to consider supporting businesses to take on apprentices. We make a plea in the report for the creation of a Scottish Jobs Guarantee Scheme, a scheme led by business and convened by Scottish Government. The scheme would offer secure employment for at least 2 years to 16 to 25-year-olds to be paid at the living wage and access to training and the hope of progression. We have asked Scottish Government to respond to our report before the end of July. Interventions must be commensurate with the scale of the issues in relation to inequality, education and unemployment. We need strong leadership across our society, and perhaps the most essential element of such leadership in a crisis is courage. And in the words of Nelson Mandela, courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I'll hand back to First Minister.
Many thanks indeed, Benny. And as Benny said in his summary there, the group have asked the Scottish Government to respond to this report by the end of July. And as I said in my opening remarks, that's a recommendation we have readily accepted. We will give a full and substantive response to all of the recommendations in that timescale, because we have to make sure that the scale of our interventions are commensurate with the scale of the challenge, but that we also move quickly, which we are committed to doing. I'm going to move straight to questions now. The first question today comes from Douglas Fraser from BBC Scotland.
Good afternoon. A question first for the First Minister. Do you see the Scottish Government taking, as suggested here, significant stakes across the economy in companies at risk of collapse, judged to be of strategic value? Just as one example, Alexander Dennis Bus Builders in Falkirk, we heard last week about concerns that the order book is now so weak that it cannot sustain the level of workforce that they've got. Is that a company that could come into part government ownership? And also a question for Benny Higgins, if you don't mind. For someone who is listening to this, who fears their job is at risk due to the current downturn, is this report telling them that their job is secure, or that it's time to plan for a change of career and that the government should be there to support them?
Okay, I'll hand over to Benny in a second. If I can briefly take the question for me. I don't rule that out. In fact, we will look positively at whether government intervention, including, as you say, taking stakes in companies, can help keep productive companies that have a future beyond this crisis from going bust and keeping them in operation. I'm not going to link my answer here to any specific company, because it would not be appropriate to do that. So please don't read anything into it in that specific manner. But I would point to the interventionist approach that the Scottish Government has already taken over the past few years. I can point to BIFAB, which still has a long road ahead of it, Prestwick Airport and others, where we have been prepared to intervene either with stakes or with innovative financial interventions to try to stop companies going out of business. So we will be very open-minded to that. But as I am duty bound to point out, we operate in all of these decisions within certain constraints. We operate within the constraints of state aid. We operate within the constraints, the very important constraint of value for taxpayers' money. So there is always a very rigorous assessment has to be done before we come to decisions like that. But we will be open-minded and as inventive and creative as possible as we try to steer our way through this crisis. Benny.
Douglas, last month we reported an increase in unemployment figures of 30,000, and we have got 628,000 people furloughed. We have 146,000 people on self-employment support. That adds up to a total of 774,000. There is a real risk to jobs, and I think that lots of different people will feel in different ways, but we have a duty of care, a duty to intervene. And the steps set out in this report, I think, give Scotland the best chance to get Scotland back to work, which has got to be the absolute priority.
Thanks, Benny. Stephen Brown from STV.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, First Minister, to you, you'll note in the report it says that particularly with the relationship to business, that some of the feedback suggested the relationship and dialogue between business and the government needed to be improved. And it says that we think that there is a pressing need for a reset. Do you accept that the relationship between the government and business has not always been up to the mark during this, and does more need to be done? And to Benny Higgins, you say in the report that your recommendations are an action list, not a shopping list. So therefore, do you expect all of them to be implemented? And you've hinted on the furlough scheme in terms of going further for other sectors. Do you think the furlough scheme should be extended by the UK government?
Firstly, from me, I warmly embrace that aspect of the advisory group's report and that recommendation. And I think it is important to accept that after a crisis like this, we have to consider the quality, the nature and the depth of relationships and make sure that they go forward on a basis that is recognising the scale of the challenge. I think we've got, between government and business, both individual businesses in different sectors, but also the key business organisations, I think we've got a good relationship, but there will always be tensions. And I think in the best of times, we should always look to see how we strengthen and deepen those relationships. But I think anybody who would, any leader like me who would say that we come out of a crisis like this and proceed in any aspect of this just in the way that we always had would not be doing her duty. So I look forward to thinking through with business organisations and businesses how we use the expertise that businesses have got, how we best engage and how we best deepen that dialogue. Because one of the things that comes through Benny's and the advisory group's report very strongly is that if we are to recover the economy, and if we are then to lead the economy into that resilient, sustainable place that we want to take it, then that is a collaboration. Government has to lead, but government can't do it all on its own. So that collaboration and relationship is important, and I certainly give an undertaking here today to focus the Scottish Government on making sure it works as people would expect it to. Benny.
I think in the first instance, the emphasis has got to be on protecting jobs rather than paying unemployment benefits. So it's, for me, important, therefore, that we, as we move away from almost certainly a universal furlough type arrangement, that we have and we make judicious choices about where we need to offer support. I think that's also aligned to what kind of Scotland do we want in future. There are certain industries in Scotland that we have to make sure survive. And so I would favour an extension of furlough, but probably on a much more targeted basis.
Thanks, Benny. Peter McMahon from ITV Border.
First Minister, thank you very much. This, as you mentioned, being the first day where wearing face coverings, particularly on public transport, is mandatory. If people are not following that, what should happen to them? Is it a matter for the police? Is it further advice? Because if they don't do it, obviously they could endanger others. And if I could, a question to Benny Higgins. You've highlighted one of your recommendations is supporting the Scottish Government and local authorities in getting schools back working again, educating people. You've experienced at HBOS, RBS, and latterly Tesco Bank, including as Group Strategy Director for Tesco. wouldn't those kind of skills that you have be useful for the Scottish Government? And have you volunteered to help the First Minister in what will be a massive logistical exercise, or has she asked you to help?
The fact that Benny's standing here having just chaired this group suggests that I have asked him to help and he's willing to do so. On the question for me, look, on face masks, face coverings, I should say more accurately, this is the first day of them being mandatory on public transport. We will consider what the compliance of that looks like. I have been very clear this is mandatory, so therefore enforcement issues clearly may come to the fore, but I would rather we didn't start from that perspective. We want people to understand the benefits of wearing face coverings, the benefits they give to other people by wearing a face covering and the benefits they get from other people doing so. So we will consider with the transport providers what compliance has been like, and I will continue to focus on trying to get the message across that you are protecting others by wearing a face covering, and others wearing a face covering are protecting you. I will also later this week, as I said last week, set out the conclusions of our consideration around whether or not we move to a mandatory position in shops as well as on public transport. Benny.
Yeah, it's been. I've enjoyed working on this particular project, but this is any other conversations are not for today; they're for another day. But I think that this report does give Scotland a chance to have a new perspective and to prioritise its effort, because one of the things that's most important, I think, in a small developed economy is that you place your bets where you are most likely to succeed that can then benefit the whole of the economy. That's one of the underlying themes in this report.
Alan Smith from Bauer.
Thank you, First Minister. My first question is for Benny Higgins. You've said that the spine of the recovery must be green. So I was wondering how you would respond to comments from the Scottish Greens this lunchtime that your plans lack the urgency needed to build a green jobs recovery. And for the First Minister on schools, the Mental Health Foundation Scotland has today raised concerns that social distancing in classrooms could compound distress and trauma in children. And they want the Scottish Government to consider the psychological consequences of social distancing. So my question is, what consideration has been given to the mental well-being of children when it comes to social distancing when they return? And the Scottish Tories have called for an emergency statement to be made to Parliament this week in regards to education. Can we expect such a statement?
Well, on that last point, I think we're ahead of them, and the Deputy First Minister will make a statement to Parliament subject to agreement of the Business Bureau tomorrow on our next steps on schools. As we have made clear, we want to get children back to education on a full-time normal basis as quickly as possible, and that is because of the importance of getting children back into education, starting the process of any catch-up on education, which is, as Benny said, is a theme of his report, but also because we recognise that from a mental health perspective, getting children not just in school but interacting with their peers and their friends on a normal basis is really important. So for all of these reasons, that is our objective, and we've been very clear about that. The difference, I guess, and you know, I say this just as a statement of fact, the difference between saying that as a government and saying that as opposition is, in government you have to create the conditions to make that happen, and that is what we are very focused on, because I think the one thing hopefully we would all agree is that the return to full-time normal education has to be safe, and it also has to take account of the considerations to protect children's physical health and the physical health of teachers who are also often parents and have families as well. So turning that ambition into the reality that we want is the hard work of being a government that we have underway right now, and the Deputy First Minister will say more about that tomorrow. I'll hand over to Benny. Before I hand over to Benny, just in terms of if that is what the Greens have said, can I say Benny's report and the advisory group's report, to be more accurate, has been published now, I think, for less than 2 hours. And I think for any individual party or organisation, simply writing it off in that kind of summary way is a mistake. Let's take the time, as the Scottish Government will, to consider it properly and to see the opportunity that it might offer us.
Yeah, thanks, First Minister, and I would echo that comment. I'd be curious to hear precisely what they think is missing or what could have been reinforced more. We make it very clear that we want a green spine to the recovery. We actually used an approach to analysis which is based on 4 pillars of capital. Firstly, the old-fashioned one of financial and physical capital, natural capital, human capital and social capital, and made the point very clearly that each pillar of capital is equally important. When we talk about conditionality, the green conditions associated with conditionality of interventions is very clear. I must say, as I went virtually around the country and we received many submissions, there were people who were prepared to say that they thought more needed to be done, but they weren't very good at telling me what it was. But fortunately, we had enough very good submissions that we were able to curate for this report.
And there'll be a debate on this report in Parliament over the next, I think, tomorrow as well. So there'll be an opportunity, rightly, for opposition members to have their say and make any further suggestions. Fraser Knight from Global. Can I say I inadvertently missed Fraser off the list of questions on Friday, so I'm going to offer him the opportunity for 2 questions today, should he want it. Fraser.
Thank you, First Minister, and I appreciate the apology as well. As part of the report today, it says that targeted and urgent action will be needed to address the attainment gap when schools go back. Now, you've said that the Scottish Government will be scrutinising plans from councils ahead of their return to make sure that they are maximising face-to-face learning. Some parents are already hearing from councils some of their plans, though. For example, Western Bartonshire Council posted on Facebook last week saying that some pupils could face as little as 1 day of contact per week. I was just wondering, do you think that councils are perhaps getting ahead of themselves by putting these plans out already? If, as you say, the Education Secretary is still set to announce things tomorrow, things could change. Are they just adding more uncertainty to the mix for parents?
No, I don't think they are. The plans that councils have been working on are plans that it has been essential for them to work on, which I've described as contingency, because they are based on 2 metres physical distancing. They are based on what we will have to do if the threat of the virus is still at a level that means normal schooling cannot be delivered at that time. So that work is essential, because we don't, as I've said before, one of the things I would love to have and don't have right now is a crystal ball. As I mentioned earlier on, we are seeing some concerning signs about what the virus is doing in other parts of the world. So we have to have contingencies if later in the year, at any point, we need to move to a model of schooling that is less than full-time schooling, because the risk of the virus is high. And that work has to be done, and that's what councils have been doing. But as I've also been saying, and I said this, I think a week ago today, standing here, we want to get to normal full-time schooling as quickly as possible from August, and that's what we are working on now. The conditions for that include making sure that the virus is at a sufficiently low level. Now, we're on track with that right now. That's one of the reasons why we've got to stay on track, and the Deputy First Minister will set out more on that when he makes the statement in Parliament tomorrow. And the other aspect of this, which is really important, whether regardless of the full-time issue, which is important, is how over the next period we assist young people to catch up with learning that they have missed. And there'll be a number of ways in which we consider doing that. But again, the Deputy First Minister will say more about that when he makes a statement tomorrow. Did you want a second?
Yeah, if you don't mind. As part of your Phase 2 announcement last week, one of the industries that say that they were taken aback was the hospitality industry. You said yourself that you're looking for more advice before you recommend that beer gardens and outdoor restaurants can reopen. Now, some of them have told us that they spent hundreds of pounds essentially planning for a relaunch. Now, I was just wondering, when was it that you knew that you wouldn't be able to offer them the ability to reopen as part of this phase? You said, like I said, you were looking for more advice. When did you ask for that advice?
We asked for that advice sometime, I think, over the course of the last week or so. I can't recall right now exactly what date that was, but can I say something a bit more fundamental? And people who've been watching me standing here will have heard me say this. When I was anticipating the decisions about moving into Phase 2, I expressly said, standing here, we may not be able to do everything in Phase 2, and we may not be able to do everything that we can do in Phase 2 all at the same time. At no point did we ever say to anybody that everything in Phase 2 would happen, or that it would all happen on the first day of Phase 2. Now, I appreciate that businesses find all of this very difficult and want as much clarity, and I want to give businesses as much clarity. But part of that is also about saying to businesses that there are sometimes good reasons why we can't give indicative dates. We've tried to do that where we can, and as I said in my opening remarks, I intend later this week to set out a bit more detail looking ahead to the remainder of phase 2 and into phase 3, some further clarity about indicative dates for reopening sections of the economy, and also for example, expanding the extended household group that we announced last week. So we will continue to set out as much clarity as we can when we can. But I come back to the central point about needing to do this carefully. I absolutely know that as we see the virus in retreat here in Scotland, as it is now, because of everything we've all been doing, the temptation is to say the risk has gone away, so let's just all get back to normal. And nobody would love more than me to do that. But I can point right now to China, I can point to Germany, I can point to parts of the United States, I can point to South Korea, I can point to outbreaks in different parts of the world where they are seeing spikes in cases again. Now, that doesn't mean we stay shut down, but it does mean that as we come out of lockdown, we must continue to be careful in how we do it. And I know that's frustrating for people, but it would be even more frustrating, I think, for us to act without that care and caution now, and then a few weeks or a couple of months from now, I'm standing here saying that we have to have another blanket lockdown. That's what we are trying to avoid. So I would appeal for patience. We are going in the right direction, and we will see more clarity in the days to come, but we still have to do this carefully, or we will all regret it in the weeks and months ahead. Tom Eden from PA.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon. We've just had the first weekend since you announced the move to phase 2. At this point in phase 1, you expressed concern about things like the number of dispersal orders issued by police, and said then you may have to enshrine some of the guidance in law. What's your opinion of how well people complied this weekend's just gone, and what's your current position about giving the advice stronger legal underpinning now? And quickly to Mr. Higgins, your report looks at care homes and calls for action to, I think, strengthen the capacity and sustainability of the sector. How would you envisage doing that?
Quickly, for me, first of all, I've not yet seen today the figures from Police Scotland or from transport providers about numbers of enforcement notices or the usage on public transport. I'm not standing here right now and saying that I'm of the view at the moment that we need to put bits of guidance into law, but we will always keep that under review. My overall sense is that the vast majority of people are abiding by the rules that we're asking them to abide by, and where people are perhaps breaching that, they will be doing it inadvertently, not deliberately. But I also get the strong sense, and I think this is understandable, I feel it myself sometimes, of just a frustration to get over this and get onto the other side of it. And also, I think people see the numbers now, and fear of the virus may be starting to recede. And I don't want anybody to be living with fear of the virus or fear of anything, but it's really important for me to continue to send a message that if we want to continue to go in the right direction and pick up pace and get more clarity about how we reopen, we've got to stick to the rules that are still in place. And fundamentally, the most important of these, and this will become increasingly the case as we open up more, are the 5 bits of advice encapsulated in that facts formulation. So if you do nothing else, memorise that and abide by that. And even if you're out and about doing more, you are still, if you abide by those 5 bits of advice, you are reducing the risk of getting the virus or passing it on to someone else. So please, please, please get those facts firmly into your mind and make sure that you're abiding by that. Benny.
In terms of the care sector, I think what's become very, very clear is just how important a strand it is in the social pillar of capital. And we have spent considerable time talking to both public and private sector participants. And we think it's very clearly something that has to be looked at very closely. It's been more centre stage in our society since the onset of this crisis, and there is a separate piece of work that's being pursued to take that on in detail.
Thanks, Benny. Michael Blackley from the Daily Mail.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you. The report today sets out that there is an estimated 33% fall in Scottish GDP in each of the months where the current social distancing measures are in place. I'd like to ask Benny Higgins, first of all, if he believes that this impact would be reduced if the 2 metre social distancing was reduced or scrapped altogether. And also to the First Minister, if Boris Johnson does go ahead with moving away from 2 metres in England, will you speed up your review and a decision on that in Scotland?
I'll hand over to Benny first so that I'm not seen to be influencing his answer in any way, shape or form.
I think there are two frustrations in the way these questions are being asked. The first one is there is a sense of a false binary outcome, that the answer of 1 is right or 2 is right. The calculus of what makes social distancing work is much more complex. It relates to how far you are from the other person, how long you spend with them, and what the environment you're in is. The second point I'd make is words like we should be braver or we should have more ambition just don't, I think, work in the context of a deadly invisible virus. That all said, we do absolutely need to get kids back to school. We need to get businesses back to work. The economy will cause carnage in future if we don't get there. But there is no question, I think it's uncontroversial to say, that a second wave would be cataclysmic if it led to a uniform lockdown.
Thanks, Benny. And from me, in areas that are within my responsibility as First Minister, it's important that I and the Scottish Government, we take our own decisions on the basis of advice, because I'm accountable to the Scottish Parliament and I'm accountable to the Scottish people. We will, of course, as we always do, pay attention to developments elsewhere, whether that's other parts of the UK, and particularly other parts of the UK, given the geography, and indeed other parts of the world. But we have to go through a process of making the assessments and listening to the evidence and applying the judgment in our own way. I have asked for further advice, as I set out in Parliament last week, from our scientific advisory group on the physical distancing issue. We will have that advice very soon. I said I'd report on it by the 2nd of July at the latest, and I will do that. And of course, we'll pay attention to any evidence and advice that is published to support a UK government decision, as I assume that they will do that. I would simply say, and it's, comments I've made before, that this isn't just a straightforward black and white binary issue. It's not the case that there is a safe distance. Risk increases the shorter the distance you have. So you have to consider the environment that is in, you have to consider other mitigations, and you have to consider the risk overall. And I think it's important that these things are done carefully, and there are some scientists, experts in this field who would say, yep, you can safely reduce the distance, perhaps with some mitigations, but there are others who say the level of transmission of the virus right now in the UK is still too high to do that. So we have to consider these issues carefully, and that's what we will do. But we're not, in terms of the advice that's coming and the reporting of that, we're not going to be very far behind what happens, whatever the decision might be in the UK tomorrow. Tom Martin from the Daily Express.
Hi, thank you, First Minister, and good afternoon. A couple of very brief questions for Mr. Higgins, if I may. Mr. Higgins, do you agree with Andrew Wilson's assessment that Scotland's recovery could be the worst in the developed world? And secondly, briefly, if I may, you talked about the need for greater flexibility in terms of the fiscal framework and the need to be able to provide fiscal stimulus. In your own view, what kind of money or borrowing powers do you think we need to be able to provide that flexibility?
Well, the first thing, I don't really want to waste time talking about how bad it could be. I'd rather talk about how much we can recover and how quickly and how we can do it in a resilient fashion. The question of, how much do we need? Well, I've already given you the benchmark. If Germany needs 4% of its economic output to stimulate the economy, then you'd think that we need at least that. So that's 6 billion. The current limit on through the fiscal framework is 450 million. So there's a long way to go from where we are to where we need to be. The other point I'd make is, and this is a rather arcane detail perhaps, but the way in which the fiscal framework works is that if we underspend on capital, we're not allowed to redivert it to revenue spend. Now, because of the COVID crisis, there is a significant underspend in capital. And if we could just get an immediate, even one-off relief from that particularly arcane rule, we could have, say, something, I don't know what the number is, but it would run into the hundreds of millions, and we could deploy it in what's called revenue, but I think today we could call it human capital and social capital. I would spend it all in education. We could deal with a large amount of digital poverty. So that's an idea that we could try and approach here and now.
Thank you. Christine Lavelle from The Sun.
Thank you, First Minister. Last week you said that you agreed with the entirety of the analysis from Professor Schreeder, who said schools could reopen as normal if daily case numbers are low enough. A key point of her analysis was for an expansion in testing to ensure that we're catching all cases in the community. She said that community testing should be ramped up massively. So what plans do you have to increase community testing, and why are we still only using about a third of our daily capacity?
Well, again, I won't repeat all of the comments about the different strands of testing and why I don't think it is right to see it in that simplistic way. But we are ramping up testing. We've got the programme for care home workers. We will, and the Health Secretary will set out more later this week on plans to test groups of NHS staff. I think as we open up the economy, we'll be looking at testing in different areas. Testing in schools, for example, may be a part of a package that allows you to get schools back on a normal full-time basis, and we are doing increasing surveillance testing as well. So what I said last week I absolutely abide by, and would say again, you cannot pick and choose the things that an expert says, and the comment actually that I made was directed at others who were saying that they agreed with Professor Schreeder on the aspiration to get schools back, which I agree with as well, but weren't so keen to talk about the other thing that she said was that means we have to continue to be cautious about coming out of lockdown and make sure we're continuing to suppress the virus. So the point I made last week is that if you're calling for the conditions to be right to get schools back full time, you also have to sign up to the patient way we're coming out of lockdown, because if you don't do that, the danger is you don't create the conditions to get schools back full time, because you may see the virus growing again. So that's the point I was making, which I hope is one that others will take account of. Alistair Grant from the Herald.
Hi there, thanks very much. Pubs, bars and restaurants could have to take the names and contact details of customers before they are allowed to enter under plans being drawn up for the next stage of lifting the lockdown down south. I think similar measures have been put into force in New Zealand. Is this something Scotland is also considering?
Yes, I think that is something that may very well be necessary. I don't want to preempt the advice that I've asked for around physical distancing, but if we think about how Test and Protect works and the importance of contact tracing, then I think in particular environments and settings, then the ability to have the contact details of people in order to quickly track them is certainly something that has a lot of merit. So very firmly, I would say, obviously we will publish guidance more generally ahead of different sectors reopening, but I would say very firmly at this stage that is something that is under consideration. Scott McNabb from The Scotsman.
Thank you, First Minister. Mr Higgins referred to the 30,000 job losses that we've seen in the last quarter, but we know that's likely to worsen dramatically later in the year, particularly when the job retention scheme comes to an end. Can I ask why the jobs guarantee recommendation in the report was restricted then to 16 to 25-year-olds? Could it be extended to the wider workforce?
So I'll ask him to respond to
that.
Look,
I think there's never been a time in our lives when we have to prioritise more. Prioritisation is always important, but right now, one of our big fears is the long-term scarring of that age group. They will emerge into the workforce at the end of their secondary or tertiary education, or have just left education and find themselves in the job market. So this was a programme that actually has been run in Edinburgh. Indeed, Dame Sue Bruce was one of the members of my group, and she was involved as part of that particular programme, and it was very successful. So it's very specifically aimed there, because that, I think, is a very high priority. Kids at that age do not deserve to suffer long-term effects, and this is one of the key areas where I think this kind of intervention can make a difference.
Thank you. And while we will respond in full, I do think that kind of recommendation is really important, because I couldn't agree more with Benny when he says that we can't allow this generation of young people to bear the long-term legacy of what we've lived through these past few months. Muir Dickey, Financial Times.
Thank you. First Minister, you said you warmly welcome the part of the report that calls for a reset of the government's relationship with business. Does that mean that you accept what it describes as authentic concern about the way government has engaged with business previously? Indeed, there seems to be a broad sense that the government doesn't care enough about business. Do you think that's a justifiable concern? And if so, what would you be planning to do about it?
So I don't, well, I know it's not true that the government doesn't care enough about business. In government, you find that, understandably, and this is not a criticism, people will find, you will find that people in all sorts of different sectors and different walks of life will think that the government should care more about them rather than care about other things. That is human nature. But clearly the government cares about business. Business is crucial to the success of our economy, and the success of our economy is crucial to our ambitions for a fairer, more equal society with strong public services. So we care passionately about the health of business. I don't think that it's fair to say that government doesn't engage with business. But I also, and I think this is a point that the report makes, if that is a view and a perception, then we have to recognise that as real and address it. In any relationship, if one party thinks that the relationship needs to get better, then the relationship's not going to get better if the other party to that relationship ignores that. So that's why I warmly welcome it. I think there is some important thinking for us to do about exactly how we engage, but more than engage. I mean, I had a discussion with the key business organisations last week. That will be a regular discussion, but there's lots of individual businesses lie behind that, and I think it's about how we make sure that we're hearing views from a broad panoply of business interests, but also how we benefit from the expertise that businesses have. And I think one of the things that Benny has suggested is perhaps looking to second people into government on particular pieces of work. So I'm very open to all of that. And I think while that would be valid and legitimate at any time, I do take the view that there is a sense I have just now, and it's not just in the economy or on business, it's generally, if we come out of this crisis feeling that we can just pick up from where we left off going into the crisis, then I think we'll be making a big mistake, because we won't be responding to the scale of the challenge we face, but also we'll probably be missing opportunities to do things better. I'm not sure, I'm speaking personally here, I don't think my outlook on life and the world and politics is not going to be the same coming out of this crisis as it was going in, and I think that is going to be true overall. So let's make sure we take the advantage of trying to do things even better in future as we face up collectively to the scale of the challenge we face. Simon Johnson from The Telegraph.
Hi, First Minister. There's some interesting polling out at the weekend showing that quite a large proportion of the population would feel uncomfortable going to a pub or a restaurant or going into a shop or going on a staycation. Do you think a major piece of work needs to be done in order to encourage people to spend? Because obviously consumer spending is such a big driver of the economy. And for Mr. Higgins, can I just ask, you've advised that there should be an education-led recovery, yet you've also acknowledged that the finances are going to be tight coming out of this. How are universities supposed to deal with the massive loss of income from international and our UK students? And if there's no vaccine, then we might need more teachers and a larger school estate. And I just wondered what your views on that, in terms of how that should be funded.
I'll hand over to Benny in a minute, although I think it's unfair of me to expect him to solve every problem that we're going to face over the next few while, and there's some big ones in that question. The question to me, yes, in short, I do think we've got a job to do to build confidence, to get people, shopping again, getting people going back when they're open to pubs, getting people to go on holidays within Scotland, staycations, if you're able to go on holidays. And one of the fundamental things here, I was making this point to somebody in the retail sector last week, is for government really to get fully behind that, as we want and will do, I have to be able to look people in the eye and say, when we're asking you to go back to, say, the shops, I'm confident that we're not asking you to take inappropriate risks there. Now, if I'd said, as some might have wanted me to do 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, let's reopen shops, I wouldn't have been able to do that because I didn't think at that point that was a sensible, safe thing to do. When the non-essential retail, non-essential is never a great phrase to use, but when the parts of retail that haven't been open up until now open again a week today, I'll be able to say, we've taken this at a pace that we think is, careful enough. So yes, abiding by all of the rules that are in place, get back out there and shop. And I think that's an important aspect of doing this at the right pace and in the right way. And when hopefully, barring unforeseen developments in the virus, tourism reopens again around the middle of July, the 15th of July, I, as First Minister, will be encouraging everybody who is able to get out there and have a staycation somewhere in our beautiful country, hopefully with some decent weather along the way. Benny.
It's a very good question. It's a question that will be around for the next while. How do we finance our way out of this crisis through into recovery, where we build a better, stronger Scotland? A couple of things I would say. First of all, we do know that following the financial crash in 2008, some of the austerity measures taken at UK level have left us less resilient than we would have been, and in fact we're now paying the price of that lack of resilience. The second point I would make, and it's an echo of some things I've said already today, which is the importance of prioritisation. We need to understand which parts of our economy and society are systemically important so that Scotland does not wither and can thrive again in future. And the university sector is one of them. So there's no easy answer to how we finance this. But at the end of the day, we've got to do what we can. We've got to be prepared to have a repayment of debt approach that takes a very long time. As Anton Muscatelli, who's was on my group, said at the weekend, and it's reported in the Times today, this is more like a kind of war footing for finance. We've got to adopt that approach, but it makes it all the more important that we focus our energy on the systemically important parts of Scotland that will form the basis of a stronger, better Scotland in future.
Thank you. Andrew Learmonth from the National.
Thanks, First Minister. If I can just ask again about ownership stakes. The report talks about the Scottish Government having taken ownership stakes in Ferguson Marine and Prestwick Airport, but could you see ministers investing in smaller businesses where there's only a handful of employees? The report sort of mentions ownership stakes, particularly in relationship to tourism events and hospitality. Could we even see the government, do you think, investing in pubs and B&Bs and hotels? You also suggest the Scottish Government look at the state-owned Parador hotel model in Spain. I was wondering if that's something the First Minister was thinking about or looking at.
Look, I'm not going to go much further today than what I've already said on this. I think it's important that we consider the report in its round, as we will do, and respond to all of the recommendations. I also don't want to set hairs running in particular sectors or around individual companies, because while, as I've said, and we can point to past decisions and actions by the Scottish Government to bear this out, we are absolutely open to doing this where it makes strategic sense. We have very rigorous and robust processes of assessment and consideration that we have to go through before we take decisions like this. As I said earlier, state aid, value for taxpayers' money, and we have to be able to make a case that it is delivering overall benefits. So I don't want to, absolutely don't want to close my mind to this, because it is anything but closed. But equally, I don't want to give the impression that these things are absolutely straightforward, because they are not. There are some instances where those assessments simply don't add up to the ability for us to make these decisions. So they have to be carefully weighed up, and as I say, lots of work have to be done around them. So in principle, yes, and we don't rule that out, but I think it would be wrong to go into too much detail about the different sectors or companies in which that would be appropriate, because detailed consideration has to be done. Tom Peterkin from the P&J.
Good afternoon. The report talks about the need to adapt North Sea oil infrastructure for carbon capture projects. And I think, Mr. Higgins, in your preamble, I hope I'm not misquoting you, but you sort of suggested something about decoupling from scarce and harmful natural resources. I wonder how you see the future for North Sea oil and gas extraction after as we come out of the pandemic, given that there's an awful lot of jobs dependent on that particular industry.
Yeah, look, anywhere where there's a lot of jobs, we've got to be very, very careful and selective about our interventions. The point I was making about the circular economy, where you do decouple the growth in products and services from the scarce or harmful natural resources. So, for example, there are now those that make clothing are much more focused on the use of recycling of clothes, so they don't have to always go back to the virgin source of cotton or wherever it may be. But specifically for the North Sea, it's an important employer. We've got to make sure that we treat it as such. But I think what we also know is that with the oil price likely to be low for a long time, the most likely outcome, that we need to look at how we can also reposition some of the apparatus. And Dieter Helm, who's a very prominent academic in the world of natural capital, who was on the group, did say that he thought it was a golden opportunity for repurposing of that apparatus for carbon capture and storage. So that's why it was in the report.
Thanks. And lastly, we have Terry Murden from Daily Business.
Hello there. The report today sets out a broad vision for recovery, but it deals with the sort of things that we've been talking about for years, like greater collaboration of public and private sectors, faster planning decisions, better broadband, reskilling the workforce. We've heard a lot of this sort of thing before. It's also based on conditions and powers which don't either exist or which are some way off, such as powers over borrowing, monetary policy, even interaction by the Scottish National Investment Bank, which is at least 2 years away. So what makes you think that this report will create the sort of changes that previous reviews have failed to achieve? And have you had any encouragement at all from Westminster that it will provide the required support to make it happen, such as, for instance, cutting VAT and indeed providing these extra borrowing powers?
Can I say a word and then I'll hand over to Benny? If we don't see this crisis as an opportunity to do things more quickly that, yes, we perhaps have been talking about for a long time, then we will never grasp that opportunity. And one of the things that has struck me, not just in business in the private sector, but in the public sector over the course of this crisis, is the way in which things that we had been talking about for a long time suddenly happened and got done. I mean, I'll give just one example. In the National Health Service, for a long, long time, perhaps even going back to the days when I was Health Secretary, we've been talking about greater use of technology for video consultations in the health service between GPs and patients and clinicians more generally. And patients, and some progress has been made around that, but it hasn't been quick enough. Within literally 2 or 3 weeks of this crisis hitting us, the Near Me programme was rolled out across the entirety of the National Health Service. So sometimes there's not very many upsides to this crisis. It has been grim, awful, dreadful experience for everybody. But sometimes in a crisis, you make things happen that are difficult to make happen outside of a crisis. And we've got to hold on to that and make sure that we don't lose the progress that's been made, but we still get that sense of momentum, because we absolutely need it now more than ever. And on the discussions with Westminster, look, I don't pretend that these discussions will be easy. Some of what Benny has mentioned today, reductions in VAT, for example, we hear, I think as recently as this morning, some promising noises coming from the Chancellor. I hope we will see some significant fiscal stimulus from the Treasury in the period ahead, as well as a commitment not to cut off furlough support prematurely. Some of what I was reading from the Treasury this morning would worry me a bit more about looming spending cuts to come. I think that would be a disastrous thing to do, but we will continue to try to have these discussions on a constructive basis. I think that will be more difficult and challenging when it comes to the fiscal framework. But if, again, I think everybody across the spectrum of constitutional opinion here and across the spectrum of political opinion absolutely now sees the importance of the Scottish Government having much greater fiscal flexibility in order to provide some of these investment-led solutions and initiatives that we badly need. So I hope that while these discussions are never easy, a bit like making quicker progress with things that we've tried to do for a long time, we see a different environment in which we can take them forward to a much more productive outcome. Ben.
think the first thing I would say, Terry, is that there are some genuine new ideas here. So, for example, our encouragement around the digital infrastructure, okay, there are some things like the R100 programme proceeding at the moment, but the idea of subsea cables that would allow us to follow the Irish example, and furthermore to set about having a proper thriving data centre industry in Scotland that would again add to resilience, which has become one of our really new priorities, I think is worthy of note. The second point I'd make is that I've said already we had very extensive engagement across the country, across all parts of the country geographically and sectorally, and we welcomed any ideas, any new ideas. And I can tell you that we got some very good contributions, but there's a lot of people who are happier just to be settling for telling us what's wrong and not giving us ideas. We didn't turn down any good new ideas. And my final comment is, you know, there is no shame in us using a crisis, as the First Minister said, to accelerate things that should have had oxygen before but didn't. The things that we have said that should happen that have been mentioned before, this is the time to do it. And if this isn't the time, there never will be one.
Many thanks, Benny. That takes us to the end of the list of questions today. My thanks to the journalists, my thanks to Jill, our BSL interpreter for today, and my huge thanks again to Benny and all of the members of the advisory group for producing a report of this substance for us today. The Scottish Government will now take a bit of time, not very much time, but a bit of time to respond in full to all of the recommendations. But there is absolutely no doubt that this report gives us a very strong foundation on which we start to build that inclusive, sustainable, resilient recovery that we need to do so. And as we hopefully come out of the health crisis and avoid going back into a health crisis, the focus that we need on that economic recovery will be brought to bear not just by government, but all of those, business, the third sector and others, that we need to work together to achieve it in the period ahead. So Benny, thank you very much indeed. As I indicated earlier on, I'll be back here tomorrow for the usual update at 12:30. The Deputy First Minister will make a statement in Parliament tomorrow on the work we are doing to try to get schools back full-time as quickly as possible. And later this week, I will also set out some further clarity in terms of how the next few weeks in our exit from lockdown might shape up, assuming we continue to suppress the virus. But for now, thank you, and my plea to you remains, please keep following the advice. Remember the facts and follow that basic advice, because that's what all of us can do to make sure that we continue to get this virus under control and, crucially, keep it under control in the weeks to come. So I will see you here tomorrow. In the meantime, thanks very much.